that we need to be sure that we're addressing on our campus. Not only because Dr. Watts says so and it's local policy, but also because there are federal laws that require that we take this issue very seriously, Title IX and all the related legislation that go along with that. So we're very fortunate that UT System was willing to provide 2 individuals who work with the Office of General Counsel. Just so you know, they have a whole, I call it a fleet of attorneys at UT System that are available to us when we have concerns and investigations. We always have an attorney who can be assigned to us to work with us on the issues. And we're fortunate that 2 of these attorneys that we work with are here today. We have Ashley Palermo and Paige Barnett, and the 2 of them work with these issues on a regular basis, and they have a lot of examples to share with you. The one thing I want to mention to you is be sure that you sign in. I know a number of you were signing in as you were coming in or went out there a little while ago. Do not leave without signing in, so we've got a record that you attended. That's very important. So I'm not going to take any further time on introductions. We'll just turn it right over to our 2 speakers.
Thanks, Narita. Hi, everybody. I'm Ashley Palermo, and this is my colleague, Paige Barnett. And as Narita said, we both live in Austin and work for UT System. So that means that we advise all 14 of the institutions across the system. So, and you guys, we work with a lot because you don't have a lawyer on campus. So anytime there's legal advice needed, whatever department calls our office and we're assigned to help. So what we're going to talk to you about today is sexual harassment and sexual misconduct. And this is a topic that you've probably heard recently in the news if you've been following or not living under a rock and following Baylor football. This is a huge topic, and as Narita said, we're required to tell you about it. But more than that, as Paige so aptly said several times yesterday, it's something that you should want to know about in the sense that we want to make this a very comfortable community for everyone that's here. And so the more we know about this topic and know how to deal with these types of situations, the easier we can do that. So with that, we'll jump right in and talk about Title IX. So when I was a kid growing up, I thought that Title IX was all about women being able to play sports. So this is why I got to play sports growing up, Title IX. And that's true. That is part of what Title IX does. But Title IX does a lot more than that. This is the official definition. But basically what it says is that everyone, regardless of their gender, gets to have an equal educational experience. And you can't be biased because of your gender while you're having that educational experience. So this is why things such as sexual harassment and sexual misconduct come into play. And I want to make clear that when we're talking about gender, we're not just talking about female gender, okay? We're talking about men can be sexually harassed, women can be sexually harassed, transgender people can be sexually harassed. It's an equal opportunity situation. So that's what we're going to be talking about here today, and I really encourage you to interrupt us if you have questions, if you're not catching something, or if you want us to explain something more fully. We're really happy to stop what we're saying and talk about it. Fix your collar.
Oh, I can spend an hour looking at that collar standing. Okay, so it's a federal law. Title IX is a federal law, and the reason why one of the reasons that universities, institutions all across the country are so concerned about it is that if the federal government comes in, the Department of Education does an investigation and finds that that an institution hasn't been in compliance, then there can be repercussions, including the withholding of federal assistance. And basically all public and private institutions get some kind of federal dollars, whether in terms of student aid, that's considered the part, one example of how we get federal dollars. So there's a lot of that's why it's a big motivating factor for institutions to pay close attention to it, in addition to the fact that we want to take care of our students. So when Ashley was talking about this transition, Title IX was a major way that women's sports got funded because there was a disparity between how men's sports and women's sports were funded. But then starting in about 2011, the Department of Education issued this Dear Colleague letter that they were going to use Title IX, and they were going to enforce Title IX in a different way and look at, in terms of gender, how it has been more frequently, but it's not exclusively women, have been the victims of sexual assault or sexual harassment or sex discrimination. And that letter laid out the framework for institutions to understand what their obligations were in order to comply with Title IX in that regard. And then, here, I'll let you talk about that.
Sure. So not too long ago, the main way that institutions, so kind of prior to 2011, the main way that institutions handled any complaint of sexual harassment or sexual violence was, especially sexual violence or sexual assault, was that they let the police handle it. And the police did an investigation. They may have turned it over to the district attorney's office, and the district attorney's office decided whether or not they would prosecute. If they did, great, all's well that ends well. That individual, you know, went to jail. If they didn't, that individual kept going to school. And what the problem with that was, is that people who were, and we don't like to use the word victims, but I'll use it because sometimes it's more descriptive. The victims of these sexual assaults were like, wait a minute, I have to go to school with my rapist? Like, I'm in class and the guy that raped me is like right next to me? And so what the Office of Civil Rights said is, we're going to put the burden on colleges and universities to investigate those matters as well. And so while there might be a concurrent situation happening with the police, if something happens with regard to one of your students or here on your campus, you're investigating it too. The university's investigating it too and can take actions to remedy that. So the most recent piece of legislation was the Campus Sexual Violence Elimination Act, also called the SAVE Act. And this basically required additional crime reporting for not just sexual assault, but also for domestic violence, dating violence, and stalking. It required that the campus policy amendments address sexual violence. It required employee training, which we're doing right here, and prevention and awareness programs. We're going to talk more about domestic violence, dating violence, and stalking. But I would say in talking to this crowd, this is something you need to keep your eye on. This is something you're going to see with your athletes and with your students, is somehow participating in this. More than sexual assault, dating violence and domestic violence are the two greatest things that we see now at UT institutions. So what is Title IX compliance? What do we actually have to do? You have to investigate, and you being the university, when there is actual or constructive notice of sexual harassment or sexual misconduct, and then you have to take prompt and effective action to stop the misconduct, remedy the effects of harassment, and prevent the recurrence. So I'm not very talented when it comes to PowerPoints, but I'm particularly proud of this graphic at the bottom because it talks about you have to investigate, then stop, then prevent, then remedy. Okay, so that's really what we're going for here. So Paige's going to talk to you about what is notice. What does that mean?
So there are a couple ways that an institution is considered to have notice. One is that a student takes advantage of the formal procedures that are on the website. Actually, on the institution's website, there's a policy that tells students what they can do, what mechanisms are in place for them to report an incident that might fall under Title IX. So that would be actual notice, this filing of a complaint when they go to NARETA or to HR or Dean of Students or something like that.
Or coming to you.
Or coming to you. Well, and then that feeds into the constructive notice, because if a student reports something to someone who they reasonably believe has the duty to report, right? So you're not one of those formal people who's in the title of where they should go necessarily in the policy, but they might believe that if they report something to you that they've had an experience, or one of their friends has had an experience, an incident that could meet the definition of sexual misconduct, and we're going to get into that a little bit later, then you have a duty to report. And so we're going to talk a little bit about who those people are, but I guarantee you guys fall into that category. So if somebody comes to you, that means the institution now is on notice that there's been a student who's experienced an incident that might meet the definition of a Title IX incident. And another way that if somebody doesn't come to you directly, if you're aware, faculty staff, coaching staff is aware of sexual misconduct that's gone on, maybe you haven't been told directly, but you've overheard it, you hear people talking about it, in the locker room or on the field or wherever you are, and whether, this is a sensitive topic. I don't love going into the graphic details, but the headlines are out there, right, with other institutions across the country about the type of misconduct that's gone on in a team environment and that coaches are aware of, and that they either weren't told directly, but they knew maybe that it was going on. And if they don't do anything about it, they get in trouble. They get the institution in trouble. It's not good for anyone. So that's also that kind of constructive notice. You haven't been told directly, but you know it's happened, you know it's gone on. That also then puts you in the situation where you must report it to the institution.
And I'd like to, I'm starting to see eyes glaze over, which happens right around these slides, because it is very dense information. So I want to go talk a minute about constructive notice, and what are we talking about, right? What are we actually talking about? Because everybody knows that if there's sexual assault, like that's really bad news, okay? And we're gonna do something about that. But more likely than not, that's not what we're talking about. More likely than not, we're talking about sexual harassment. And so I used this example yesterday, and I think it's a good one. I'm sure everyone saw the video of Donald Trump and Billy Bush on the bus. Anybody not see that video? Anybody not watch television or surf the internet? Okay, so everybody saw that video. And I think everyone can agree, well, let's hope you can agree, that everything that Donald Trump was doing was very sexual misconduct behavior. Okay, so remember, he was gawking at the reporter standing out there. He was talking about he grabs women by the P word, talking about how he is, he can kiss women without consent. He just goes up and kisses them on the mouth. So all of that talk, clearly sexual misconduct, all right? And if you don't think so, I'm telling you, it's clearly legally sexually misconduct. What is harder to recognize is Billy Bush, his conduct, okay? Remember, he was the one that was laughing in the background, all right? Laughing in the background, and then when they got off the bus, he encourages the reporter, give the Donald a hug. Come on, give him a hug, right? He's egging that behavior on. I would drop down if you told me that you haven't witnessed that kind of behavior by students on this campus. Because I've seen that kind of behavior by people my age, okay? Of creating an environment that is hostile towards another group, and in this case, women. Paige is pulling something up on the phone.
Yeah, well, so that's exactly right. And then I just wanted to follow on quickly right on this, because it's just another example that's in the headlines right now. Harvard. Have y'all heard about the teams? I mean, the soccer team, right, has been disqualified. I mean, they're not allowed to play anymore because of what was going on. Like the athletes had spreadsheets ranking the women on the other teams. I don't know. I haven't read enough. I was just going to try to skim through to make sure I don't want to cast aspersions on faculty or staff who are involved or not involved. So I don't know all the details. I hadn't read all the articles, but that's an example of, if you know that some students are making spreadsheets and ranking women and what sexual positions they should be in, that's the kind of thing you got to shut down. And if you need guidance on something like that, then, your institution is here, or you can take it in your own hands and say, that's not going to happen at our school. And the thing is, I think there's always a concern of, like, if I see misconduct going on, if I report it, then there could be repercussions that I don't want to deal with.
The team might lose.
The team might lose. That's no good. Everybody likes to win. But ask Art Browse how that worked out for him, right? I mean, I haven't read all the details. I don't know all the details, but to the extent that the institution, so just take it from the fact that the institution considered him to have knowledge and be responsible, and he didn't do anything, and also others as well. If you don't address it, we don't mean to harp on athletics, clearly, but that's where a lot of the headlines come from, because that's where the dollars are, and that's what the press wants to write about. So it's not a matter of us, like, here we are to, we're talking to all range. We have 5 sessions a day. We had 2 sessions yesterday. This is the only time we're talking exclusively athletics. So we're talking to everybody about this. This is everybody's responsibility. It just comes up a lot of things that we hear about in the news are, and things we see on campus, and of course we, serving all the institutions, we hear about it, clearly not just in athletics, but throughout an institution, things like this can happen. But it just kind of goes to show, highlights, I guess, the kind of, unique position that athletics faces sometimes.
I think that's right. And, I see Steve Isanina over here in the corner. Hey, Steve. Steve and I have worked together a lot, and this is a topic that's very important to him. I mean, we've had this conversation numerous times. He has attended numerous trainings, really kind of gone out of his way across the state to go to various trainings about this topic. And so I point that out to say to you that I think that you have the support of the upper level people behind you. So if there is something that you think is reportable, I don't want you to think that you're going to get in trouble for reporting it. Actually, it's quite the opposite. You can get in trouble for not reporting it because you are a responsible employee, okay? The Office of Civil Rights has determined that certain employees on campus, which all of you fit in this category, are responsible employees. And that means you're people who are mandatory reporters. So if you see any of this conduct going on, you have to report it. You're required by law to do so. And if you don't, you can be in trouble, which is really kind of a shame because you probably didn't do anything wrong except for not report. But that's wrong in and of itself. A responsible employee is someone a student could reasonably believe has the authority or responsibility to do something about their problem, okay? And so you are those folks. You're in a leadership position, and students are going to look to you to take action, and the institution is looking to you to take action too. So again, this is where you fit: administrators, faculty, supervisory staff, advisors, your supervisory staff. Exception, any employee with confidentiality obligations. I doubt that any of you fit in this category, but if you are, you also have a dual role working in the counseling center as a licensed counselor. When you're in that role, anything someone tells you is confidential. If you're a priest, pastor, or rabbi, and someone tells you something in that role, it's confidential. And if you're a healthcare provider, I'm not talking about an athletic trainer, a healthcare provider, like a doctor or a nurse, and someone reveals something to you in that kind of capacity in a health exam, then you have a confidential, you're a confidential reporter. Otherwise, you have to tell, okay?
So we're saying, okay, you're responsible, you're responsible, you're responsible. We've said that for like 15 minutes now. So what does that mean, right? So you have to have the sensitivity to recognizing what constitutes sexual harassment and helping promote the institution's policy. So that's the example of, nobody's come to you directly, but you know that you've overheard students talking about ranking women on the women's soccer team or something, like whatever Harvard just got in trouble for. That's the sensitivity to recognizing that that's not okay, okay? So then acting promptly, that's also what you're responsible for, to report it to Title IX. But then also value the confidential nature of the complaint to the extent that an individual comes to you, and we're gonna talk a little bit more about confidentiality, but if somebody comes to you, then obviously that's something that, you can't promise complete confidentiality to that person because the institution then has an obligation to investigate it. But you certainly, that would be the type of thing that you would only then share with the people who need to know, right? Which would be the Title IX office, and probably that's about it. And so then the final on this slide is to effectuate a discrimination-free environment. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that with several slides about which is about this promoting the policy and keeping an eye on the kind of conduct that is going on.
So what is sexual harassment? I'm not going to read this slide. I apologize for this slide, but it's one of those things where you don't really know how to put sexual harassment into one clear little slide, so I just put the whole definition up there. I encourage you, UTPB has a sexual harassment, sexual misconduct policy. It's on your website. It's a dense read, okay? But I encourage you to go on there and read through it, and especially read through some of the definitions, because I think it will give you a clear understanding of where everything fits in the full picture. And sexual harassment, what is it? I mean, you kind of all know what it might be. It can be doing something because you feel pressured, like quid pro quo sexual harassment, that if you do this, then I'm gonna give you a starting position on the team. It can also be the thing we just described, locker room talk, okay? That's sexual harassment, that's sexual misconduct. Basically, it's a form of sex discrimination that includes all of these things below: sexual violence, sexual assault, stalking, domestic violence, and dating violence. And so that's what this whole thing is really about, is diminishing sexual harassment. All right, sexual assault, that's an offense that meets the definition of rape, fondling, incest, or statutory rape. And then the biggie, consent. This is not something that you have to decide, okay? I just want to let you know that if someone tells you something, or if you feel the need to report something, you're not the investigator. No one's relying on you to like put the pieces of the puzzle together. We have a team of people in Narita Holmes' office that does just that. They investigate these things, they figure out, was there consent, was there not? But when you're talking about these things with your students and with your student athletes, I want you to try to weave some of these words into your conversations. Talk about consent. Talk about how nobody should be doing anything with anybody unless everybody has consent. Everybody has consented to exactly what is happening, okay? So this is the UTPB's definition of consent. It talks about how consent is, you can't even have consent if you're incapacitated in some way. The biggest way that folks are incapacitated is they're drunk, all right? Now, just because someone has had some drinks doesn't mean they can't consent, all right? That's a common issue. People automatically think, oh, they were drinking, they couldn't consent. Sometimes people can consent. The question is, how drunk were they, all right? And then dating violence and domestic violence. As I mentioned earlier, these are the two things that we are seeing the most. And it's really disheartening. I've been involved in the world of domestic violence. It's been a personal interest and cause of mine for a long, long time now. And I think it's finally coming out of the shadows, whether that be good or bad. But since we've started doing all of this in the last couple of years, we've seen a huge spike in the increase of reports of dating violence and domestic violence. So I just encourage you to keep an eye on that. Talk with your players about that issue. Talk with both men and women about that issue. We need men who are going to stand up to that issue as well, and we need women who are going to stand up for one another and report it themselves when it's happening. And then stalking. Okay, so stalking, you know, when I was in school, I always thought of stalking as like circling like your ex-boyfriend's house, right? To see like if anything had changed since the last time you had circled. That can also be stalking, but stalking nowadays is all about electronics. So it's all about texting, it's all about social media, Instagram, Snapchat, barrage of messages, just barrage of messages. I literally had a case recently where I had a binder this thick, and all it was were text messages that had come to the person who was being stalked between 12 a.m. and 5 a.m. And just text after text after text after text after text after text after text. And so if somebody is complaining about that kind of thing happening to you, that's not just annoying, that's stalking, okay? And that's something you need to report. Okay, so Paige is going to tell you who you would report to if you're going to report.
So y'all probably already know Narita, gave us a kind introduction. She's the Title IX coordinator on campus, and her number should be easy for y'all to find online. We're going to send her on this presentation afterwards also, so you'll have that as a resource. So she's the person to get in touch with. And her office oversees compliance with the Title IX policy. They process the complaints and conduct the investigations. And then they oversee remedies and sanctions. So sometimes remedies, and I think we talk about this in some later slides, also might be when a report is made, depending on the type of conduct that's alleged, there might be immediate like interim action taken to keep students apart. So we don't wait necessarily until an investigation is complete to address the situation. We might do something in the interim before a determination is made. and her office would be involved in that. And then, of course, they're responsible for training and putting on, fabulous morning meetings like this today. And then we're training, like we said, we're meeting with all faculty and staff. We're meeting with RAs. We're meeting with investigation with the investigators who they get training as well. We're meeting with hearing officers also. So, it's from top to bottom. It's something that now, everybody on a campus needs to be familiar with, and also students are getting trained, right? So they're learning what their rights are, and they're learning how to take advantage of those policies and procedures when they feel that they've experienced something, or they know someone who's experienced an incident that might fall under that. And when I joined higher ed, I practiced law for over 10 years before I joined UT System, and it kind of dawned on me as I was becoming more familiar with kind of the types of issues that the institutions face. It's like, well, this is a heavy burden on institutions, right, to do this and to put this burden on coaches and faculty and staff and the Title IX offices to have to deal with sexual assault. And these are very sensitive things, and so it's not an easy topic to talk about. It's not necessarily easy for when we're first learning about it now to understand our roles, but it's first of all a legal requirement, but it's also about, protecting students, right? It's protecting the university. It's protecting you to understand what the rules are and to understand what the responsibilities are, because we don't want students who have experienced sexual harassment to not have any options or remedies, right? We want to be able to address those things, and we want to, make students feel safe. And so that's why, it's a lot sometimes to talk through and think, I just want to coach. I just want to teach. Why do I have to police my students? Come on, like, they're college students. They don't. Their brains are still developing, for heaven's sakes. Like, we see that a lot in the cases we get. Like, well, it's under 25. She's under 25. Of course, the brain's not even fully developed. So, they make decisions on a Saturday night, or they do things that, you think all of a sudden, why do I have to be involved in policing all this? And so it's kind of not necessarily what you thought you were getting into when you joined the institution, but it's now something that we do as part of our responsibility to make sure that the educational environment is what it should be for these students. So we're going to talk a minute about confidentiality. I know that many of you probably are very close to the student athletes that you're in charge of, and that's great, and I think you should be. And so many of you probably have almost even a friend relationship with some of your players, and that's good, because that encourages people to feel comfortable and to talk to you about things that maybe they wouldn't talk to you about. The toughest thing about all this is that there is confidentiality, but then there isn't, right? So because you're a responsible employee, because you're a mandatory reporter, if anyone shares something like this with you, you have to report it. You absolutely have to report it. So what I have to tell you is, if someone comes to you and says, I really need to talk to you about something, but you can't tell anybody, okay? You need to say, wait, I just want to let you know that if this is going to be something about sexual harassment, sexual misconduct, sexual assault, any of those things, I have to tell someone. So if you need a confidential source, I can take you to one of those places that we talked about earlier, Student Counseling Center, the health center where they meet with a doctor or a nurse, or a pastoral counselor, okay? But if not, then you need to say, you can't promise that you won't tell anyone. You can say, I promise that I'll only tell people who absolutely need to know. So I'm not going to be blabbing this everywhere. I'm not going to go across the hall and tell my, friend who's the coach of the men's soccer team. I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to tell the people, Narita and her office, those people that absolutely need to know. Okay, and then you can offer support and say, and I'll be here for you, and we're going to get through this. But you can't promise absolute confidentiality. Records, this is just kind of an FYI, some things that might come up. A student's educational record is protected by FERPA, which is another federal law, and any type of investigation into any sort of Title IX incident is protected by FERPA. So there are going to be some things that you may be called to set aside or provide, such as notes or
any other information that you might have in record format.
So I'm going to put Ashley on the spot here for a second. Here we go. So this is, so we can talk through like a hypothetical, right?
Okay, you're not going to make it define them.
No, I'm not going to be, this has nothing to do with FERPA. We stay far away from FERPA because we have other experts in our office to help us with that. Is that, so say that you, this is about reporting and confidentiality, right? So if you are, say, an assistant coach, you're not a head coach, and you have somebody, a student comes to you to tell you something that happened. I was at a party, I saw this happen, and I think it's wrong, and you need to know it's one of our players, and I'm worried about, you know, the incident that occurred. And if you're an assistant coach, like I would think, me being a, I have a boss too. Like if I hear a complaint about a colleague and I might be uncertain what to do, I might want to go to my next line supervisor before I go to HR, before I go to Title IX. Like, what do you think is, because I think there will be an inclination or at least a thought of, okay, now I've learned something. Do I go straight to Title IX? Can I talk to my coach about it? Can I give him an FYI or her? What do you think is a good way to handle a situation like that?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think it's both, right? So I think that you have a mandatory obligation to report to the Title IX coordinator. So I think you have to do that. I think it's just good business sense to also report that to your boss, who could be the head coach, right? However, if you all remember a few years ago, the whole Penn State situation, there were assistant coaches that did report it to the head coach, all right? And look, my husband is from Pennsylvania. I'm a huge Penn State fan. He's a huge Joe Pa fan, all right? But Joe Pa screwed up. He didn't move forward with it. He just sat on it. And so, and those assistant coaches ended up losing their jobs too, right? Even though they had reported it to them. So do yourselves a favor and go ahead and report it to Narita, but then also tell your boss, and tell your boss you've done that. And there is absolutely nothing wrong with you doing that, and you can't be disciplined for doing that. In fact, that's retaliation, and the person who disciplines you for doing that can be fired. Okay, so that would be my advice on that one. Okay, so we talked a little bit about this, effectuating a discrimination-free environment. What does that mean? Well, there's some things that could be going on behind the scenes after a complaint is made that you may not know about. One of those could be interim action. That could be reassignment, suspension, and no contact orders. Now, I've worked with many of the departments in athletics at UTPB before, and so I know that some of these things have occurred. I know that we've had students taken off teams before, or given, they're suspended from the team for a certain period of time for certain actions. They could be suspended from school for a certain period of time. Then obviously that's going to impact you, because if they're suspended from school, they can't play on the team. And the big one is no contact orders. So typically when something happens, both parties are given no contact orders, so they can't contact one another. All right, so it's not just the person who's accused of doing something wrong, it's the other individual as well. And the reason we do that is a lot of times especially in dating violence and domestic violence situations, the complainant might change their mind. They might get back with the person who they originally accused of having an issue with. So we have these no contact orders in place so that we can kind of regulate that a little bit. So you might be called upon to say, to help enforce those, and to say, look, I'm sorry, Tim, you can't be in this practice space right now because Lori is here. And I know that there's a no contact order, and so you can't be in the same space together, okay? There's an investigation that's also going on, and that's the evidence gathering. That's what you would think of as an investigation. People are gathering evidence, trying to figure out who's telling the truth, really, because there's two sides to every story. And a lot of times it comes down to a credibility determination. We have to figure out who is more credible and who's really telling the truth. And then finally, there's a report that's done. And sometimes that report finds that the behavior that was complained about didn't happen, or that there's not enough evidence to say that it did happen. And then sometimes the report says that we do think it happens. And then we proceed from a disciplinary standpoint from there.
So throughout this process, before anybody can be suspended or there can be any sanctions put on, we are making sure that all students involved are getting their due process when there's disciplinary action that's going to be imposed. And we're a public institution, so students have due process rights in their in being here and being students at this public university. And so that means that they have notice of the charges against them, and they have an opportunity to respond. And so none of this would happen, you know, somebody who's been accused of sexual misconduct or violating the policy in any way is going to be aware of this. This isn't proceeding, you know, in kind of a secret process or something like that. The student is involved, knows what the charges are, has an opportunity to respond, has an opportunity to present witnesses and at the hearing. So that's what, that kind of secures their opportunity, you know, to be able to address these allegations brought against them. And Ashley's already mentioned this additional violations that kind of arise sometimes out of these initial complaints are retaliation, right? You can see retaliation if a student complains, or a lot of times, you know, these are similar policies to what you might have learned about with respect to employment law, right? I mean, there's a lot of similarity here. So you can imagine, like Ashley had just mentioned earlier, say an assistant coach reports something to Title IX office. If a supervisor wasn't happy with that, if they take any kind of action and retribution, that would be retaliation, and that in and of itself would be something that could be disciplined and investigated separately. Interference with an investigation, we sometimes see that with, say, like a respondent, the accused, say, their friends, for example. Ashley tells a story about something she dealt with at a different UT institution where the accused was a guy, and he was from a really wealthy family, and one of his buddies was contacting the victim, the alleged victim, and said, listen, if you withdraw your complaints, we will, you know, through text messages, so thank you for that written record, through text messages to say, if you withdraw this complaint, you will be set for life, because there was potential, and I believe the student eventually was suspended or expelled from school. So that's that kind of interference that, you know, when you have, a lot of times it's friends or even the accused, him or herself is trying to influence and interfere with the investigation. So that in and of itself can be, can lead to discipline. So again, this is just kind of goes to what the institution can do to effectuate a discrimination-free environment. We're doing it right now. We're raising awareness, training the campus community about the policy, trying to reduce the risk for the institution, for our faculty and staff, and for the students, of course. And bystander intervention is something that we encourage as well. So a lot of that happens on the student level. We encourage that. A lot of students try to encourage each other to intervene, to if they see somebody heading into a situation that might put themselves at risk or might end up with somebody making a bad decision, you know, you try to address that in as positive a way as possible, to say like, hey, it's time to move on, it's time to get out of here, or I don't want to see my girlfriend go with that guy because I know she's complained about him before, so why don't you come with us, that kind of thing. And then obviously we get the personnel involved in implementing the policy, and that's what we're doing here.
So the next thing we're going to talk about, and this is particularly something that Dr. Watts wanted us to talk about, so we added this piece into this presentation. We're talking about the consensual relationships policy. So UTPB has a consensual relationships policy, and the first question you might be asking is, what is a consensual relationship? It's a romantic, dating, or sexual relationship agreed to by the parties involved, hence the word consensual. And this includes hookups and/or one-night stands. Okay, so this is any two people getting together in a romantic way consensually. All right. So, what are the prohibited consensual relations? First is a consensual relationship between a supervisor and a supervisee, regardless of whether the relationship is direct or indirect. So what does that mean? Direct means, you know, Tim supervises Susan. All right, you can't have that. Indirect means Tim supervises Susan, who supervises Emily. You can't have a relationship between Tim and Emily either, because indirectly there's a supervisory relationship. Unless the supervisor discloses the relationship in advance and a management plan is in effect. Now this is the biggie. This is really the whole reason we have a consensual relationships policy, is a consensual relationship between a coach or athletic staff member and any student athlete or student assigned to or associated with the athletics department, such as interns or student employees. This whole policy came into effect because of a situation that happened at another UT institution, perhaps the flagship, perhaps a few years ago, with an assistant coach who had a relationship with a one-night stand with, I believe, a student trainer. And in our office, this whole policy is known as the insert the name of the coach rule, okay? It's all about him. Listen, people, I don't want any of you to have a rule associated with your name, okay? It's just not a good thing. It's not a good thing unless it's some sort of like, you know, winning rule or something, right? Then that's fantastic. Otherwise, you don't want a rule attached to your name. So, this is a no-no. This cannot happen. It absolutely cannot happen. If it happens, I would encourage you to report yourself. And I know that seems difficult, but believe me, you'll be in much better situation if you report yourself than if someone else finds out about it, which has happened. I'm thinking about whether it's happened on this campus or not. I cannot recall. Probably might have. Certainly happened at other campuses. There's never going to be a management plan in situation number B. Like, that's just not, it's not permissible. In the top one, perhaps there could be a management plan, we could switch people out, but the Board of Regents has been very clear. No coaches and any students or anybody affiliated with the athletic department in a supervisor or supervisee role. Absolutely not, okay? On that point, I just want to make one little plug for something that, you know, you guys have all worked very hard to get where you are. And I mentioned earlier that many of you probably have very close relationships with some of your student athletes. That's great, okay? But please remember that at the end of the day, those people aren't your friends, all right? You need to make friends with yourselves and other people, because you just can get yourself in a bad situation. I have a good friend who's a professor at a school out in California, and she's a professor in biochemistry, which is a very hard and very like dry subject. And there's not a lot of people with personality in the biochemistry department. And she has a lot of personality. And so she's like the darling of the biochemistry department, because everybody, all the graduate students and all the undergrads want to be her friend because she has a personality. And I went out to visit her a couple weeks ago, and she was talking about going out and, you know, like having a glass of wine with some of the graduate students. And I was like, just don't do it. Just don't do it, okay? I know it seems like it's a good idea and it's fun, and these people are close in age to many of you, all right? But they're not your friends, they're students. And if something happens right after that, okay, it doesn't even need to happen right at the time that you're having the drink. It can happen right after that. And they say, well, where were you right before this happened? Well, I was with Coach. We were having a couple of beers. Okay. All of a sudden, the investigation spotlight zooms in on you, whether or not you've done anything wrong. And you don't want, just like you don't want your name associated with a rule, you don't want the investigation spotlight centered on you, okay? It can ruin your career. It really can. And is it worth it? It's really not. It's more, just become friends with people in this room. You know, you're all adults, you're all working professionals, you all go out and have some beers. But don't do it with students. It doesn't matter if they're over 21, just doesn't matter. Because here's the thing, students know their rights these days. They're all very, very well informed, and the internet has made them even more well informed. And all it takes is something to go south, and then they can report something that may not even be true, but then it's spotlights on you, okay? So that's just a little word of advice. All right, so reporting requirements, you have to report it. That's the end of the story. You have to report it to the appropriate dean or director level administrator. For you guys, I would report it to the VP of Human Resources. That's just where I would go. And you must make the report prior to entering into the relationship, or if the relationship exists, with as much advance notice as possible. Look, there are situations where you might come to work here, and then maybe you bring your partner along, and that person starts taking classes, at UTPB, or that person walks on to one of the teams or does something. If there's something that's occurring already before you ever get here or before that relationship exists and you report that, more likely than not, that's okay. What we're really talking about is things that spring up once you're here. And then you must collaborate to effectuate a management plan. Like I said, for you guys, that's not gonna happen. Sorry, it's just not. That typically happens in faculty situations where maybe we can move somebody out of that department, or we can work with it, but in athletics, it's just not.
With students, like.
Yeah, with students, right. And again, even if you effectuate a management plan, that doesn't mean you haven't violated the policy. You could still be disciplined for a policy violation. So, but that shouldn't discourage you from actually reporting, because the problem that occurs is that down the road, the relationship goes south and somebody who's in the less position of power files a sexual harassment complaint and says that from the beginning, that person was coerced or forced to enter into this relationship, okay? And that's where things get really messy. Anything else on that?
Yeah, the only thing I guess that I would add that is, we talking about the relationships, say, the things that happen that we've seen at other institutions. Again, Ashley had talked about that. But with social media and things aren't necessarily going to be able to be kept secret. Like, that's the problem, right? So this, again, in some ways, this presentation is like gloom and doom. Ashley and I were talking about how do we jazz it up and make it more entertaining. But frankly, with a topic like this, you can't really joke about it, right? But the truth of the matter is, this is about protecting students. It's about protecting you and putting you on alert and helping you recognize, how to, safeguard, for your own sakes in terms of things to keep in mind and pitfalls given the role that you're in, but then also, letting you know what your obligations are. So if we'd love to take questions, if you have any questions, any hypotheticals, or, if you want to explore more any of the topics you can come up to us afterwards as well. We're happy to talk about any questions you might have, but we really appreciate your time and attention on this matter, and it's really important to the institution. It's important to UT system. Questions? All right, thank you.
You don't have